Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to this podcast. This is White Feather Council of Men podcast, sponsored by the Trinity Episcopal Church in Charlottesville, Virginia. And we have a great session planned for tonight. We're going to interview an author, Greg Jarrell. He is from Charlotte, North Carolina, works at a nonprofit hospitality organization called QC Family Tree that we'll introduce in another session because part of this interview will be with Greg and his wife, Helms Jarrell, who are co-founders of that organization. But for this session, we want to talk specifically to Greg about the exciting work that he has been doing with a published book that is now being published, I think. He's finished it, but it's in the making. As I introduce him, I do want to say that Greg is an author of another book that I've had the privilege of reading, and he actually signed it for me. A Riff of Love, one of Greg's loves, and one of Greg's one of the things that he is great with is he's also a musician. And this book, Riff of Love, is sort of written from I don't know, not musical background, but at least a musical perspective of relationships, community, and belonging. So the book is called A Riff of Love: Notes on Community and Belonging, and deals with a lot of the people that Greg and Helms has come to know as part of their QC Family Tree ministry there. And it's a great read. And I just wanted to plug it before we start because Greg's newest book is so new in the making. I guess it doesn't even have a title page yet or a picture page yet that we can show. But I do appreciate you being here, Greg. Before I turn it over to Phil, I just want to ask if there's any quick remarks or hello greetings that you want to say. I do thank you for being here. I know Greg from seminary days when he was a student, and I was a staff member at what was then called BTSR, Baptist Theological Seminary at Richmond. And Greg struck me early on as a person of great integrity and a person who just had a great passion and compassion for people and the community that he was living in, and just how he how Greg carried himself with other people and relationships, and the depth that he brought to conversations and our relationship. So I appreciate you being with us, Greg.
Yeah, thanks, Warren. I'm so grateful to be able to. We've stayed connected over the years,
Yeah,
which doesn't always happen, and so I'm glad for that. I'm glad to meet Philip. And Warren, I was thinking just before we started that you and I helped to start some anti-racism work at BTSR, probably in like 2002 or 2003, 20 years ago. I'm not sure that we really knew what we were doing. Well, we didn't know what we were doing then, I am sure. But we were doing the best we could, and we learned a lot in the process.
we sure did. Thanks for mentioning that, Greg. That was what, over 20 years ago now or something like that.
Yep.
And one of our listeners, I don't know if she's on tonight, but one of our listeners and supporters is Ayuko White. And you may remember her. She helped develop those sessions and those emphases at BTSR. And she's involved in this church that is now supporting this work of White Feather Project. So that was sort of my connection to this work through her and through that work that we did together there. And yeah, we didn't know what we were doing, but we were traveling some path together.
Right, we were.
And what I will say is the needle hadn't moved as far as I'd wanted it to move in that amount of time. I mean, we're still talking about some of the same issues that we did that many years ago.
Yep.
So thanks for being with us. I'm going to turn it over to Phil for a first few questions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Warren. Greg, it's so great to finally meet you in this format, and we're just excited to have you. This has been a blessing for Warren and I with this podcast. You know, when we started this, we didn't know each other. We came together. It's just been a wonderful relationship, and we're just excited about having this opportunity to do this work. And in reference to your book, is it still in production, or is it ready to be released soon? Like
Yeah,
title?
the book is in production. It is called Our Trespasses. The
Mm,
subtitle is White Churches and the Taking of American Neighborhoods. Um,
okay.
and so it will be published February 2024 by Fortress Press, which is the Lutheran publishing house nationally.
Hmm.
Um, so I am actually working this week and next week to kind of finish what should be the final edits on that. And the rest of the production takes quite a while. So it'll be 6 months or so before it's out in the world, but it's on the way.
Okay, cool, cool.
Great.
And Warren, you had the next question?
Well, I was just going to say, as you um, told us the title, can you at least share some of the main points, or
Sure.
basically what is the book about?
Let me give you the basic
Yeah.
idea. So I live in Charlotte. I live in a city. I've long been fascinated by the ways that cities are stitched together, how they get made and built. And as a theologian and a seminary graduate, then I've been thinking about cities theologically for a long time. So the particular story that I've been tracking really is kind of two stories that take place together on a single block in downtown Charlotte. So one of those stories is the story of a family who by the last name North. And so what I did was I traced the ancestors of this family, whose names were Abram North and Annie Carson, back to the plantations, the enslaved conditions that they were born in, and
Wow.
connected with their families, their descendants, who are still, some of them are still in Charlotte today. They have a fascinating story that had basically hadn't really been, nobody had dug it up to the point that that story had basically been forgotten. But it turned out that they were important politically, they were important religiously in the founding of deeply important institutions here in Charlotte. And their heirs were the first family who was forced to sell in urban renewal. So and so they part of how I made this connection was that those family members were put in the newspaper as kind of a success story, which is not at all what had happened during urban renewal. And just in case some of your listeners don't know, urban renewal was a federal program where cities directing themselves could choose to clear slums, was the language that was used. That's complicated language, and many of the neighborhoods that were cleared were not at all slums. But that was the official language that was used. And so the federal government would pay for most of the cost for cities to run those programs. So the first urban renewal project here in Charlotte took place in a neighborhood that was called Brooklyn. More than 1,000 Black families displaced, including the North family, or the descendants of Abram and Annie, right? And they had been owners of the house and the land that they were on for 75 years at that point. Wow. So the second story that goes in parallel is the story of First Baptist Church of Charlotte, a white Southern Baptist congregation with a really important history, both here in Charlotte and within the Southern Baptist Convention nationally. So very prominent people inside the Southern Baptist Convention were former pastors at First Baptist Church of Charlotte when they decided to move from their kind of Main Street location. Our Main Street here is called Tryon Street. They decided to move from their Tryon Street location, but instead of joining White Flight, they moved to this urban renewal area. And as it turned out, they wound up building their sanctuary directly on top of Abram and Annie North's old house. And the entanglement that this family and this institution had actually winds up going back a century. And so you can see that's the seeds of a really compelling story right there. And so what I've tried to do is both to dig out the history that had been ignored, or had been forgotten or had been swept over. So tried to help to restore some of the memory of the Norths. And also spent hours, hundreds of hours in archival collections, including at First Baptist Church, trying to understand culturally, theologically, how did the decision to help aid in the erasure of this Black neighborhood, and not only to aid in it, but to profit from it, what were the theological ingredients that were helping that to happen? So that's what the book is about, and then tracking it forward to calculate both the material damages, what has it cost the North family, kind of as a representative of the neighborhood as a whole, but also what's been the cost to the souls of the people of First Baptist Church, and not only them, but to all the white Christians who participated in these projects.
Well, that sounds like a very challenging and investing kind of work for you. But I want to know what motivated you, internally, deeply, to set out to write something like this and to tell this story.
So there were two things, two big things. For one, I was leading some tours, kind of following my first book, where I had been tracking some of the development history of the city, thinking especially about urban renewal and segregation, and the way that urban renewal changed the face of the city. So one of the specific questions that was consistently asked to me that I never could answer was, how come right in the middle, like in the most prominent area of this urban renewal area in the former Brooklyn neighborhood, why is white First Baptist Church there? How did that happen? And no historians around, nobody who could have known knew the answer. So I partly would
tell you the answer.
Yes, correct. So one of those historians who's prominent here said to me, we were talking about this as a potential project, and he said, "Look, this is yours to do, right? Wow. You're a Baptist minister, you're a white guy, wow. Like this is your work to do. You can get in there because they won't let the rest of us in there."
Oh my gosh.
And so, I did my best to get in, and it worked.
Okay.
And just started turning up what I could.
So
that's thing number one. Thing number two is that my work has been for the past 20 years that I live in a Black neighborhood that now is experiencing and really what really started just before COVID and was accelerated by the pandemic, this sweep of displacement. And my sense has and sort of conviction has long been that like that's not accidental, and it's not unrelated to what came before. The story of what we call what people call gentrification. I'm not sure that that's a helpful descriptor sometimes, but the story of gentrification is not fundamentally different than the story of other displacements before it. Right. So I wanted to understand the connections, and the connections are in part that, like, I have neighbors here whose families were displaced from that Brooklyn neighborhood or from other neighborhoods destroyed by urban renewal, right? Sure. Who are now facing displacement here in sort of this slightly altered set of circumstances, but the story's still the same.
Wow. Phil?
Wow, that's very, very telling. I think, your book, it kind of speaks to what I think we are experiencing nationally with displacement. My son, he's a social worker in Norfolk, and Norfolk is doing the same thing. And the work that he's doing is helping people who have been displaced to try to find affordable housing, which is
right.
a major challenge.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's real personal for me with regard to what you said. Challenges. Did you face any particular when you shared the book that you were writing with people? Did you face any challenges or people trying to stop you from doing what you were doing?
The most salient story to answer this question some of the hardest connections were with the white liberals, who felt the need, and I'm thinking of one person in particular, and I need to be careful to kind of shield some details, but I'm thinking of one person in particular who was very representative of wanting very badly to hold on to her sentimental notions about how good her ancestors had been. And so that turned out to be the trickiest relationship. And at some point, this person just kind of cut me off and said, look, I'm not going any further with this. It was too painful to deal with the reality of what had happened, right? And so part of the reaction to me was like, well, it sounds to me like you haven't really done any very good research, or I don't like what you're saying, so it can't be true, right? Because what was happening is I was kind of piercing this bubble that that had developed. And I think in the white liberal consciousness in particular, we had this deep need to hold on to our innocence. One of the things that was interesting to me in dealing with a Southern Baptist congregation, very conservative, right? Yeah. There were a lot of people that just didn't want anything to do with me there, that couldn't hear what I was saying. That's not surprising. But inside an evangelical tradition, there's also this piece of like, we're all broken sinners. And so there were some people with social consciousness by virtue of interracial marriages or interracial adoptions that they had in their family, ways that they had developed some consciousness, who could look at this story and say, you know what, we really got it wrong. Now, they weren't willing to confront the depth of what they need to do to make things right, but they also didn't try to hold on to their innocence. They could at least pierce that. But consistently with a few white liberals, I ran into this thing where it was like, no, you can go that far, but no further. I'm not dealing with this kind of thing.
Wow. Were your motives challenged?
They were questioned sometimes by people that I didn't know well, right? Which makes sense. Yeah. And by this one person in particular, yes, my motives were challenged. You're not really seeking any kind of like reconciliatory posture or any sort of justice. You're just trying to stir up some stuff or whatever.
Well, that sort of brings me to my next question. What do you hope the reader will take away from your book?
Well, how do
you want it to challenge me when I read it?
Sure, I do want to stir up some stuff. I mean, that's
I figured you would want to.
Right. So I think so one of the things that I want readers to deal with is let me see how to say this. So there are three things that I want readers to deal with. For one, I want especially white readers to understand that we still live inside this story. So I'm offering what's a history, basically, but that history is not over, like not even close to over. We still live inside that history. And so for one, I want folks, as they sit and read and sort of reflect on this, or as they hear me talk about it, to feel some of the same discomfort that I feel, to say like, this is things are still not right. And the language that I learned from my mentor, Ched Myers, and from some other theologians and philosophers, was to talk about this as a haunting. We still live in a society that is suffused with hauntings, ways that past injustices continue to live with us. Right. And so I want readers to leave understanding that they live in a haunted society and that they have a responsibility for acting in a way that can heal that haunting. And sort of parts 2 and 3 of that are the ways, the two primary ways that I think that haunting is lived out. So one is the material way. And so part of the information that I was able to dig up could kind of neatly and illustrate the material difference that it's made. So what has it cost the North family to live under this regime of white supremacy that stole their land? And the flip side of that is, what has First Baptist Church gained, in actual dollar terms, that does not rightly belong to them? And what are they going to do with a stolen inheritance? And because we all live inside that story, like that this is not just about First Baptist Church. I don't know what they'll do with it. Probably nothing. In some ways, I don't really care. I want people to understand this is our story. But secondly, besides the economics of it, the culture. So as folks read, you'll see that I was able to dig up a handful of sermons, hymns that were sung at like crucial moments that were conquest hymns. And the theological gifts or the theological burdens, the theological resources is the non-judgmental way to say this. The theological resources that they turned to in the 1960s when they were making these decisions at First Baptist Church still live with us. One of the hymns they sang was "Lead On, O King Eternal." I bet you could still sing the first verse of that, Warren, if I asked you to.
Absolutely, I can.
Because these things live inside of us.
Yeah.
Similarly, some of the scripture that they read it upside down, right? They convinced themselves as the well-to-do white people that they were like Israel instead of like Pharaoh. And the sermons went that way. And then when Dr. Carl Bates, who was the pastor, left First Baptist Church, he went to teach preaching at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Right? So the threads don't, like, this was not a one-off kind of event that happened. He became the preaching professor that taught other Southern Baptists how to interpret the Bible this way and preach that message to their congregations, right? Yeah. So this stuff runs deep. It's still with us. And folks need to be sitting in their pews troubled and listening. What are we getting wrong right now? Especially as it regards our neighborhoods, our places, the ways that we relate to the social geography of our cities.
Wow. Phil.
I'm just having all kinds of thoughts.
Yeah.
Greg, this is not one of the items on the list, but this just popped in my head. Why are we as a country, what is it that frightens people about history? Why can't we just honor history for what it is?
Well, there's no unbiased telling of history, right?
Right.
The perspective that we're telling it from matters as well, and the way that history has been told is in itself an expression of a political position or of a position of power. And so, we live in a moment where people thought that power had sort of been assumed in the way of white supremacy, and that's been destabilized significantly now. And part of destabilizing that is saying, look, we've been telling ourselves lies about history. Right? We've been telling ourselves lies about where we came from and how we wound up where we are. And part of what I think is so important about telling this history is to say, like, the neighborhood that I live in, which has been disinvested for years and years and years. It's easy for people out in the lily white suburbs to look and say, what's wrong over there? To which I would respond, well, like, on the one hand, like, what's wrong over here is political, social, religious disinvestment over the course of 60 years. What do you think happens when you deprive people of their material needs, right?
Yeah.
and also we could also look over there and say, like, what's wrong with y'all? Like, you got you live in these kind of isolated bubbles that doesn't allow you to cope with the world as it actually is. Um, and our history is all messed up with that. And that's why, that one person that gave me such a hard time. Like, we're talking about family history, and
Yeah.
she's not able to deal with sort of taking the sheen off of that family history and deal with it as it is.
Yeah. Wow. We're about out of time with this awesome interview
No,
about your
not
book,
yet.
but a few things. You know, I'm struck. The book sounds sort of dark. It sounds sort of hard to read, but I'm sure there's some positive spin on this somewhere, or there's at least some kind of light of hope, or maybe there's not. Maybe the light of hope is to wake me up as a white man. Maybe the light of hope is to get our attention and focus on a new way. But some of the story that you're telling, it's almost like depressing to hear again that, wow, this is what you're revealing. This is what you're telling us. So speak a little to that, and also speak to the general question of if there's anything else you need to say about your book before we leave this conversation.
Sure. So let me respond in kind of two ways
Yeah.
that come to mind. So for one, I did my best to convey the characters, especially the white ones, as complicated as they are, right? So none of us is a static character who never changes.
Yeah.
And so like, part of the mystery of how our political machine keeps reproducing these same results over and over is because it's often good people who help to reproduce it, right? It's people who love their mothers and love their children and would do anything for them, right? So I have tried to present things as complex without flattening anyone. So I'm not sure that it's necessarily like hopeless in that way, though it's probably unsparing. Like, I'm not going to pull any punches for sure. I think the flip side of that is that I found it deeply hopeful and fascinating to dig up some Black history from Charlotte that had been lost, in part because of white supremacy, right?
Mm-hmm.
People who, so for instance, this man, Abram North, won a political patronage job. At the time he did, was the only Black man in Charlotte to have a political patronage job. So kind of indicating his importance as a political organizer in a movement here in North Carolina that was called the Fusion Movement. There was a similar movement in Virginia. I can't recall the name. This was the fusion of poor white people and Black people all across the state, which initiated a 4-year period of extraordinary reforms in the state of North Carolina from 1894 to 1898. And it was partly the local work of Abram North through his church and through his community in bringing the fusion movement to bear, even in Charlotte, which had a deep white supremacist kind of movement here, where reforms that had happened in other parts of the state never happened in Charlotte, even at other points. So to me, that's a really hopeful history. Here's somebody who, Dr. William Barber, the Moral Mondays and the Poor People's Campaign, talks about this fusion movement all the time. They talk about the work that they're doing as fusion, or moral fusion organizing is their language, bringing people from diverse backgrounds and helping them to see their common alliances, their common interests, right? So here's a chapter from our local history, and the last scene in the book is me wandering, my children wandering through the Black segregated cemetery downtown, trying to find Abram and Annie's grave, which has not been remembered, which has not been marked out well. And so to me, it's very hopeful to imagine, like, here are my children who are saying, look, we're not going to tell the story the same way anymore, right? And we're going to go in the cemeteries and in the public squares and the churches, and we're going to tell a different kind of story that's not going to allow for us to continue living with these myths that prop up white supremacy at the cost of Black people and their neighborhoods and their livelihoods, and at the cost of white people's souls.
Wow.
So that's hopeful to me.
Yeah, that sounds hopeful, and that's a great way to put it. I'm going to end the conversation in just a minute, but I don't want to cut anything that Phil might have thought of that he wants to ask real quickly as we finish. Phil, is there anything to finish from your end?
Well, Greg he just said it. I think that
Yeah.
the young generation is really going to speak from a sense of their own perspective, not from moms or grandmoms or granddad's perspective. They're going to call it as they see it, and they are. They are. And I think it is always with each generation, we get a little bit more comfortable with dealing with the realities of our country, the totality of it. And as Greg's children have said to him, yeah, we're gonna call it like we see it. And if it makes people feel uncomfortable, so be it. But we got to at some point move beyond these myths about America and address it, in a way that's going to be beneficial to all of us. So yeah, that's I'm glad he said that.
Thank you.
Well, Greg, author and visionary and friend, I thank you so deeply for being with us tonight. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your work in this effort. Before we leave, remind people of the title. It's Our Trespasses, and then what?
Christmas. This is like the phrase from the Lord's Prayer. The subtitle is White Churches and the Taking of American Neighborhoods. It'll be anywhere you can buy books. It'll be there. There'll be pre-order links available by the end of the summer, and it'll be out in the world February 20th, 2024.
Well, based on this conversation, I can't wait till February 2024. It sounds like a very challenging read and a necessary read. Thank you for doing the work on this. I'm sure it was challenging, and thank you for sharing your story of how it came to be and what it is hopefully challenging us to do as we read and grapple with these issues. Thank you for being with us, Greg. And thanks all of you out there who may be listening. Want to thank Greg Jarrell from QC Family Tree for joining us tonight, and want to remind our listeners that you can get this and other already pre-recorded sessions from our channel on YouTube. And if you want to communicate to us outside of our sessions, you can always do that through our Gmail email account at WF Counsel of Men, as in White Feather Counsel.